By spring 1968, Robert Kennedy's rallies drew diverse coalitions. Young people chanted his name, black voters and Hispanic farmworkers saw him as a genuine advocate, and disillusioned workers felt his empathy. His campaign presented the picture of an America that might reconcile. His enemies still remembered him as an attacked dog, but for many voters, he embodied the idea that someone could learn, suffer, and change. That campaign energy, cut short by his assassination in June, became one of the most powerful what-ifs in American memory. Yet his transformation never freed him entirely from doubt. America remembered Robert Kennedy as both things, the aggressive fighter and the hopeful idealist. His greatest strength was not the erasure of contradiction, but his ability to carry it openly. Listeners sensed that both versions lived in him, and that gave his words unusual weight. He did not claim to be free of conflict. He stood as proof that conflict could reshape a person. But history guards its ironies. Even as he condemned violence and preached reconciliation, the unresolved question of his family's dealings with underworld figures shadowed his legacy. Praising him as an idealist cannot mean ignoring that contradiction. For the Kennedys, transformation often came with secrets that lingered just beyond the spotlight. And so, just as his voice seemed ready to redefine American politics, another contradiction emerged most starkly. His public war on organized crime collided with the private suspicions that his family's victories had leaned, at times, on the very forces he prosecuted. His late crusade against the mob, therefore, raised the largest question of all: whether a dynasty preaching reform had been built partly on foundations poured in darker places. But his later crusade against organized crime would raise the biggest contradiction of all: how the family's rise intersected with shadowy forces. Dancing with the mafia. What happens when campaign strategy overlaps with whispers from casinos and mob bosses? For the Kennedys, it meant that their hard-won victories never escaped rumors of organized crime connections. Long before historians debated the evidence, the talk was already there, claims that elections were shaped as much by backroom favors as by rallies and speeches. To the public, the 1960 race made history as the first Catholic president elected in America. In private, journalists, political opponents, and even federal agents recorded allegations that underworld figures had helped grease the machinery that turned anticipation into victory. Those suggestions began with Joseph Kennedy Sr. His reputation for aggressive deals during Prohibition cast a long shadow when his son pursued the presidency. As rumors circulated, people whispered that Joe Sr. called upon ties first formed in the liquor business decades earlier. These tales spoke of dockyard power brokers, delivery trucks controlled by mob networks, and casinos flush with cash. None of it landed in court. Yet the persistence of such stories, repeated by reporters and investigative writers, left the impression that behind Camelot's curtain were contacts few biographers wanted confirmed. Chicago became the focal point. Illinois was decisive in the 1960 election, and the city's Democratic machine was legendary for its influence. Sam Giancana, the mob boss whose reach extended from city wards to Las Vegas operations, appeared frequently in the allegations. According to later testimony and FBI field reports, intermediaries linked to campaign officials and entertainers approached Giancana with requests for support. The suggestion was stark. If organized networks could deliver turnout in crucial precincts, the new administration would remember. On FBI recordings, a figure in Giancana's circle spoke of campaign help tied to about $25,000 in funds, though whether those funds influenced votes or stayed within underworld hands was never conclusively proven. That is the core of the historical uncertainty. Journalists wrote stories implying ballot management and turnout efforts tied to the mob. Some mob figures themselves later boasted about their role. The FBI monitored conversations but did not make conclusive findings public at the time. And historians, even in 2025, remain divided. Some argue the narrow margin in Illinois suggests help could have mattered, while others counter that Kennedy already had paths to victory without Chicago. What is certain is this: the allegations cling to the Kennedy name not as fact, but as a permanent asterisk. The paradox only sharpened once John Kennedy entered office. His brother Robert became Attorney General and almost immediately launched one of the most aggressive campaigns against organized crime in American history. The Justice Department authorized extensive surveillance, invested resources in building mafia cases, and pursued prosecution with unprecedented zeal. To many mob leaders, this looked like betrayal. They had been courted, or at least believed themselves courted, during the election. Now their supposed allies were targeting them with indictments. In underworld slang, it was like paying off a debt only to see the collector return with a sheriff's badge. The overlap between political glamour and criminal networks was exacerbated by personal relationships. Nowhere did this overlap appear more vividly than in the figure of Judith Campbell Exner. Exner later acknowledged romantic ties with both John Kennedy and mob figures like Giancana. She described herself as a friend of Frank Sinatra, who was close to both the Kennedys and mob associates. Exner admitted that she carried messages between these circles, though how much she knew of their significance remains in dispute. FBI files confirm the Bureau monitored her contacts, noting meetings and phone calls that crossed into sensitive territory. For the Kennedys, so careful in presenting spotless public images, the revelation that a figure close to the president had ties to the mob posed enormous political risk. The danger was not simply reputational. If individuals in Kennedy's personal life also had contact with underworld figures, the possibility of blackmail loomed large. Even without public exposure, private knowledge could distort decision-making in Washington. An assassin's bullet was not required to destabilize a presidency. Possession of a secret could exert similar pressure. Advisors understood this, and so did the FBI, which quietly increased its monitoring of those crossings between politics and organized crime. Public opinion would eventually place judgment where historians still hesitate. Surveys conducted as recently as 2025 show that a sizable portion of Americans believe organized crime played a decisive role in Kennedy's election. More than 4 decades of documentaries, memoirs, and dramatizations have entrenched the idea in cultural memory. The consistency of these polls suggests the power of suspicion itself, even where archival evidence has left the ultimate verdict unresolved. When half a nation treats rumor as near history, the line between allegation and fact ceases to matter in the public imagination. Robert Kennedy's offensive against the mob only deepened questions. Each indictment, each news conference trumpeting victories against organized crime conveyed courage and principle. Yet for skeptics, the ferocity of the Justice Department's prosecutions hinted at something else, a family trying to erase the trace of obligations it wished to deny. The harder the Kennedys distanced themselves, the more observers suspected that the distance had once been far too close. Paradoxically, every conviction of a mob leader reinforced the rumor that a deal had been broken, that debts had been called in only to be crushed. Historians have struggled with the absence of airtight documentation. Election monitors in 1960 never proved systemic fraud. Congressional investigators chased leads but found no smoking gun. FBI recordings referenced money, contacts, and support, but the files alone could not prove altered ballots. The press pursued the story wave after wave, but without admissible legal proof, claims remained unresolved. What resulted is an endless loop of allegation and denial, one where speculation has taken on the weight of narrative truth. The cultural impact became nearly as consequential as the politics. Stories of Kennedy's supposed mob ties appeared in biographies, television specials, and major films. Hollywood dramatized Sinatra and Giancana's roles, making the alleged triangle of star, mobster, and president part of American pop folklore. Each retelling blurred facts further. By the 1980s and 1990s, the Kennedy mob link had been referenced so many times it seemed less like theory and more like accepted backdrop, woven into depictions of the era. And yet, for all the speculation, concrete certainty remained elusive. What persists is the paradox. The Kennedy brand, built on glamour and legitimacy, paired endlessly with claims of corruption and secrecy. For public memory, it hardly matters whether archives one day provide a final answer. The whispers alone have already become part of the dynasty's identity. Whether proven or not, these allegations shaped public distrust and later government inquiries. So the question of influence became a permanent part of the Kennedy story. And as history has shown, it wasn't just rumors of power that followed them, but something darker. Real losses, repeated tragedies, and the persistent shadow of mortality that turned politics into myth. Living under the curse. How many tragedies must strike before repetition itself starts to feel like narrative? For the Kennedys, the accumulation of grief was so visible, so frequent, and so public that observers began labeling the family's losses as a curse. The phrase did not suggest supernatural forces at work. Instead, journalists and the public reached for it as shorthand for something harder to explain, a lineage where disaster seemed as consistent as ambition. The myth settled because the facts kept providing fresh reminders, and each reminder was framed not as coincidence, but as one more entry in a ledger of misfortune. The pattern started early. The heir Joseph Kennedy Jr., groomed by his father to carry the dynasty into politics, died in 1944 when his bomber exploded over England. Only a few years later, Kathleen Kick Kennedy was killed in a plane crash in France, cutting short the life of a sister who had charmed both Britain and America. By the 1960s, the losses had moved beyond aviation accidents and into national trauma. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas in 1963. Robert Kennedy was shot in Los Angeles in 1968. Both deaths unfolded under cameras, turning private murder into public theater. And decades later, another plane claimed another Kennedy, John Jr., America's magazine star prince, crashed off Martha's Vineyard in 1999. Alongside these deaths ran another story, one less visible but equally weighty. In 1941, Rosemary Kennedy, the third child, underwent a prefrontal lobotomy at age 23. The procedure, carried out under medical approval at the time, left her permanently disabled, confined to institutions for the rest of her life. What had been presented as a step to calm emotional difficulties instead erased her independence. Historians now view Rosemary's fate as both a medical tragedy and a symbol of how secrecy operated inside the family. For decades, she was hidden from public view, her story released only gradually. Later Kennedys, including Patrick Kennedy, would cite Rosemary when discussing the family's complex relationship with mental health, grief, and silence. Her case underscores that tragedy was not only in accidents or assassinations, but also in choices and treatments that produced lifelong consequences. The accumulation turned grief into a kind of family identity. Funerals became public events, attended not just by relatives but by heads of state and broadcast live to millions. Images of Jacqueline Kennedy in mourning dress or Robert's children on the steps of St. Patrick's entered national memory as deeply as campaign speeches. Where most families mourn out of sight, the Kennedys mourned under floodlights. That visibility blurred lines between family and state, personal and national. Grief became performance, whether intended or not, and Americans absorbed it as part of the dynasty's story. Psychologists point out that such visibility creates pressure on survivors. Members of later generations were expected not just to succeed, but to project resilience in the face of catastrophe. Ted Kennedy embodied this burden. Surviving his three brothers, he spent 4 decades in the Senate producing landmark legislation on health care and education. Yet even his triumphs were measured in contrast to loss. Every scandal, including Chappaquiddick in 1969, was not seen in isolation, but as another proof point in the curse narrative. His achievements were genuine, but the shadow of repetition made it impossible for him to escape the association between the Kennedy name and calamity. The persistence of the theme is measurable. Polling in recent years shows that large majorities of Americans still attach the word curse to the Kennedy family long after many events. This persistence says less about fate and more about media. Networks and newspapers repeatedly framed successive accidents as part of a broader story until the story itself became cemented. No other political family in modern America endured that same treatment. The Bushes produce multiple presidents, but not a mythology of doom. The Clintons weather scandals, but not perpetual references to fate. The Kennedys alone became branded with inevitability. The Kennedy record of trauma also reshaped how later family members spoke about issues once avoided. Patrick Kennedy, son of Ted, has been open about his battles with addiction and depression. He has argued that the family's history of public loss and private secrecy made it harder for earlier generations to address mental health directly. Rosemary's case, concealed for decades, became an example he invoked to show why silence deepened suffering. By raising the subject in public settings, Patrick reframed mental illness as part of the Kennedy legacy and insisted that reckoning with it was part of preventing further tragedy. The cultural fascination thrives because of this combination, glamour and grief in constant rotation. Americans were drawn not only to the symbols of privilege, Hyannis Port, tailored suits, yachts, and campaign rallies, but also to the vulnerability of repeated loss. Unlike other dynastic families who seemed unreachable, the Kennedys offered a reminder that even immense privilege could not guarantee security. The juxtaposition made their story resonate, unattainable wealth balanced by catastrophes to which ordinary people could relate. With each event replayed on television and later documented in books, the public read their triumphs and losses almost like chapters in a scripted drama. For later generations, this attention has proved both sustaining and suffocating. Young Kennedys entering politics inherit not just a recognizable name, but also scrutiny magnified by history. Any struggle, personal, electoral, or professional, becomes instantly measured against the backdrop of what came before. Failures are rarely seen as their own. They are interpreted as extensions of family destiny, one more confirmation that tragedy clings. That inevitability strips some of their humanity, turning individuals into symbols in a pre-written story. Yet the paradox remains. Without these visible tragedies, the dynasty might not have endured in public memory. The curse narrative, defined as cultural framing rather than supernatural explanation, ensured their presence in headlines for decades, even when their direct political power waned. Myths in American life often require both heroism and loss. Triumph alone fades, but pain echoes. In that sense, the endless reminders of disaster made the family unforgettable, locking them into a role larger than office or election. To speak of a Kennedy curse today is to acknowledge how repetition builds myth. It is not proof of destiny, but of narrative weight compounded by high-profile deaths, risky visibility, and choices that bred further secrecy. The family's history reads extraordinary not because accidents and illness never strike elsewhere, but because their stage was lit so brightly and every loss became national property. But beyond fate and myth, these tragedies sparked public debate about secrecy in government, about the ethics of medicine, about how much citizens deserve to know about those who seek power. That debate continues, and it provides the bridge between memory and measurement. Because the question, after all the funerals and fascination, is this: in the present, how much of the Kennedys' power still rests on politics and how much rests on myth? Dynasty in the numbers. In measuring the Kennedys today, the truest mirror is not the ballot box, but the ledger of memory. They no longer dominate office counts as they once did, yet their visibility endures in ways that outlast elections. This section, The Dynasty in the Numbers, shows a family shifting from tangible strength in campaigns and Congress to symbolic strength in American culture. The shift is measurable not by exact tallies, but in how their name still surfaces in conversations long after their political engine slowed. In the 1960s, when the Kennedy Mystique was at full height, the family name seemed ubiquitous. From John and Robert on national stages to Ted anchoring Massachusetts, it felt as though a Kennedy could be found at nearly every tier of public authority. Local machines in Boston, ward bosses, and union affiliates gave the name traction. Behind the charisma was engineering. JosephPKennedySr set the foundation. He not only financed their campaigns, but also built fiscal infrastructure that underwrote their ambitions. He formed family trusts and invested heavily in real estate, including Chicago's Merchandise Mart, which the family owned for decades before selling. These holdings created independence, wealth secure enough to weather losses and finance future races. The power of the dynasty rested partly on this architecture. Money filtered into political capital. The second layer was organizational. In mid-century Massachusetts, politics often flowed through loyal union halls and urban wards. The Kennedys made sure those pipelines favored them. Voter outreach was not accidental. Precinct captains distributed leaflets, loyal constituencies were cultivated, and allies were rewarded. Elections required not just television ads and debates, but solid ground game. That ground game made the family look immovable. For decades, their presence was consistent in the Senate and House alike. At its height, the dynasty resembled not just a family, but a system, a mechanism meant to replicate itself. That system did not last. By the 1990s and early 2000s, the Kennedy brand no longer carried the same mechanical certainty. Local politics had changed. Union power in Massachusetts had weakened, and municipal machines once central to turnout had dissolved into diffuse networks. At the same time, national politics splintered. Authenticity and outsider appeal began to resonate more than established surnames. The Kennedy machine, which once seemed like industrial strength, looked more like old hardware in a digital age. The name continued to carry coverage, but the reliable structure behind it had degraded. So as the machine faltered, the family leaned into name recognition itself. By the 21st century, a Kennedy declaration of candidacy needed little more than a microphone to prompt reporters. The brand operated like a magnet. Coverage followed automatically, debates framed them as heirs to Camelot, donors answered calls more quickly, and networks booked interviews regardless of the candidate's specific resume. This was no small thing. The recognition meant that even with fewer offices in play, the family name still filled airwaves and ink.